Hi library friends, this is Miss Cindy from the Crown Point Community Library, and thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to bring the library into your home with what I call an activity in a bag. So this is a program that I've done before at the library, but since we can't do it in person right now, I thought I'd try to figure out a way to put this program into a bag that you could take home and have a similar experience. So this is all about the Titanic. So I don't know if you're like me, but I've always found the Titanic to be just a fascinating historical account, and I just like learning about it. So if you don't know anything about the Titanic, let me start by giving you a little bit of background information. The Titanic was a large passenger ship that was traveling from England to the United States. And along the path, the journey that it was taking, it struck an iceberg and the ship sunk. At that time, the Titanic, it was its maiden voyage, which meant that it was the first time that it was ever making a trip. And it was supposed to be unsinkable. It was the newest, most luxurious ocean liner, and it was going to be this perfect vessel to take people across the ocean in luxury and just be phenomenal. But that didn't necessarily work out the way they wanted, because when the Titanic hit an iceberg, it sunk. And not only was the problem the sinking, but there weren't enough lifeboats, so there were a lot of people that died during the sinking of the Titanic. So on April 15th, 1912 was when the Titanic hit the iceberg and sunk. An estimated 2,200 and some passengers and crew were on board, and about 1,500 people died. So there are lots of stories that have come out about the Titanic. The survivors have tales. There's tales or stories that came about from the one ship that rescued a lot of people. And so over the years, there have been books that have been written. There have been movies that have been made about the events that happened on that night aboard the Titanic. So what we're going to do today, if you stopped by the library and picked up one of your bags, what you found inside your bag was a balloon, some Play-Doh, and a boarding pass. So we're going to show you what you're going to do with the Play-Doh and the balloon. And then once we do our experiments with those, when we come back, I'm going to explain a little bit about your boarding pass. So your boarding pass has information. It shows a passenger from the boat, where they were traveling from, and anything special about them. So hopefully you stopped by the library and you got your bag and you have one of these boarding passes. After I show you the experiments, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you about these people. So there are 10 different boarding passes. So there's 10 different people that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them and then what happened with them. Because remember, some of the people were saved, but other people died. So we're going to come back and I'm going to let you know what happened to the person that is on your card. Okay, one of the items that you had inside your bag was a balloon. And the reason you have a balloon inside of your bag and how that's going to relate to the Titanic is the problem, what happened to the Titanic is that it hit an iceberg, right? And you would think if it hit an iceberg that was that big, why was it so hard for the sailors, for the crewmen, to not see that iceberg was there? Well, part of the problem is how icebergs are below the surface of the sea. So what you see on top of the sea is only part of the iceberg. So you're going to use your balloon to find out how icebergs float. So what you're going to do is you're going to fill your balloon with water. I suggest you blow it up first, like just blow air into it. That will help it to expand better. And then go ahead and put water in it. And then put your balloon with the water in it into your freezer. So here, and notice I didn't fill mine all the way up, okay? You can fill it more than this, but this is how big I chose to blow mine up. And I froze it. It's frozen solid, okay? It's frozen solid. And now we know how ice works, right? When you put ice into a liquid, does it sink or does it float? Well, it floats, right? So I put water into this big container, and I put my balloon in there, and I can see that it floats. Now you can do this one of two ways. So you're going to need to have some type of container so that you can put water in it, so you can see if your iceberg sinks or floats. You could do this in a sink, or you could do it in a bathtub. It doesn't matter. I suggest using cold water versus hot water, because otherwise the ice will melt faster, and then you might get different results. And then once you do that, so you can do it just like this and keep the balloon like it is, or you can actually cut the balloon. It's got water in it from where it's already started to melt. So I can cut my balloon off. And now I've got this nice giant ice cube, and I can put it in there, and I can see how it floats. So what you're going to want to do at this point is you're going to take a ruler, and you want to measure and see how much of your iceberg is below the water and how much is above the water. And that will give you a good idea of why it was so hard for the sailors that were on the Titanic to see the iceberg that was out there in the sea, the one that the boat struck and hit, and why that iceberg was able to do so much damage to some of those lower levels of the ship. Another item that you have in your bag is you have a container of Play-Doh. And when you take the Play-Doh out of the container, it looks just like this. And for this, you're going to kind of think about how ships are made, why they are the shape that they're made. So if I start with my Play-Doh and I just have a round Play-Doh, what do you think is going to happen when I put the Play-Doh into the water? What do you think we'll be able to do? Will it sink or will it float? Let's try it and see. So I put it in, it sunk, right? So what could I do with this Play-Doh? How could I shape it to make it into a shape that, instead of sinking, because the Play-Doh sunk, how can I make it into a shape that will float on the water instead of sinking? So that is your challenge to figure out. I'm not going to solve that problem for you, but if you are stuck and you don't know what to do, I suggest you start by thinking about boats and thinking about the shape of boats, and see if you could change this into a boat type shape that may be able to float on the water. And what that's called buoyancy, because the more buoyant something is, then it will be able to stay on top of the water. Okay, the first passenger that we're going to talk about on our boarding pass is a boy whose name is Edmund. And you'll notice, like on this one, it says Master Edmund Roger Navratil, okay, which I hope I pronounced his name right, but I'm not 100% positive. But he was from France. He was 2 years old. And it says master because you know how we call people by like Mr. or Mrs., but if it's a child, it may say Miss or it may say master. And that means that he was a young boy. So he was 2 years old. And then here it says he was accompanied by his father and his 3-year-old brother. He was then down here, you'll see this what class he was in. So there's first, second, and third class. First class was the most expensive tickets, and that would be your wealthiest passengers that were traveling. Second would be the middle, and then third class would be the least expensive. And if you have a third class ticket, you'll notice that there is no cabin number because they didn't actually have separate cabins. They would have been more in like a large space with a bunch of beds in it. So this was a second class passenger, and he was traveling to America, and he was traveling under the last name Hoffman. His father and mother were separated, and his father had kidnapped him and his brother and were in the process of taking them to America and got on board the Titanic. So what happened to him on that night? Well, Edmund and his brother, they were rescued. I found this like really cool website. It's called the Encyclopedia Titanica, and in it you can find out. That's how I know like what cabin number they were in and what their ticket number was, where they were traveling or who they were with. But you also find out if they were in a lifeboat, what lifeboat they were in. So they were in one of the collapsible lifeboats, Lifeboat D. And remember, he is only 2 and his brother is 3. Their father, when they started filling the lifeboats, they would take women and children first. And then any men typically had to wait until the lifeboats were full, and then they could be rescued. And so their father died in the sinking. The boys, once they got to the ship that came in and picked up the lifeboat passengers, they called them the orphans of the Titanic because there was nobody there to take care of them. There was no parent there with them. There was a first-class survivor. Her name was Miss Margaret Hayes, and she took them into her home until they could figure out what to do with them. They could find some relatives. Through watching like news, and keep in mind during that time you couldn't just do it wasn't like internet stuff, and there was no television, so there were newspapers that were getting information out, and from the newspapers their mother recognized their pictures, and she arrived in America, and she was reunited with her boys on May 16th. So that means that it was a month after the sinking that she was finally able to get and be there and pick up her boys. Okay, the next person I want to talk about is, let's see, Mrs. Leah Axe. So, and that's A-K-S. She is 18, and she was traveling from London, England. She was going to Norfolk, Virginia, to be with her husband, who had already gone ahead of her and had started a business. She was a third-class passenger. Like I said, she was 18, and she had her 10-month-old son, Frank Phillip, and they called him Philly. That was traveling with her. So we have this book at the library. It's called 10 True Tales, Titanic Young Survivors. It's in our nonfiction section, and it is a book that lists 10 true tales about different people that were on board the Titanic the night of the sinking. And her story is in here. It is mentioned in this book, the account of what happened to Mrs. Leah Axe that evening. So you can check out this book and find out more information. But what happened was she lost her son in confusion on the deck. He ended up in a different lifeboat, and they were reunited on board the Carpathia, which is the boat that came and rescued them. So they did end up together, but there was a time that she was without her son and she didn't know where her son was. She was on one lifeboat and he was on another. Okay, next we have Master Sidney Leslie Goodwin. And again, remember, Master just means that it was a young boy. He was 1 year old. He was from England. He was traveling with his family, his father, mother, and his 5 siblings. They were third-class passengers, and they were traveling to Niagara Falls, New York. They were joining other family members that had emigrated to the U.S., and they had planned to cross on a different ship. But there was a coal strike in England, and it delayed their trip, so they ended up transferring to the Titanic at the last minute. So they weren't originally supposed to be on board the ship. So what happened to them? Well, the entire family, they were third-class passengers, and unfortunately, a lot of passengers that were in third class ended up dying. And so the whole family died in the sinking of the Titanic. Sidney, this little boy who was 1 year old, was one of the first bodies that was recovered, when no one claimed him and no one claimed the body because his family had all also died. He was buried in an unmarked grave that is today a memorial to children who lost their lives in the sinking of the Titanic. Toys and teddy bears are often left at the grave. And in 2007, they did a DNA test and they confirmed the identity of this child. All right, next is Mrs. Rosalie Ida Strauss. I don't know if that's a name that you've ever heard of, but she is a famous person. She was a first-class passenger. She was 63 years old. She was from New York City, and she had been on a trip to Europe, and she was returning home. So what happened to her? She was traveling with her husband, Isidore Strauss, and her maid. So the night of the sinking, remember I told you that women and children were able to get on the boat first, but men had to wait. And so her husband, she went to get into the lifeboat, but they wouldn't let her husband get in with her. So she went ahead and sent her maid, and she decided that she would stay with her husband until her husband was able to get in a lifeboat with her. Well, that didn't happen. And the last time that this couple was seen, they were holding hands while sitting in deck chairs, just waiting as the Titanic sunk. Her maid did survive, but she and her husband died, and her body was never recovered. All right, this one's kind of an interesting story. This is Helen Lorraine Allison. She was 2 years old. She was from Quebec, Canada. They're traveling back to North America after her father took a business trip in England and took the family with them. She was traveling with her father, her mother, and her brother. They were first-class passengers, and they were traveling to New York. So as first-class passengers and being a child, you would expect that she had survived her time on the Titanic, but that is not the case. So Helen died along with her father and mother. Her brother was with his nurse. Her brother was younger, and he was with the nurse, and they ended up in a lifeboat. But her parents did not know this. They didn't realize, because there was a lot of confusion on the deck that night, and they didn't realize that the nurse had gotten into a lifeboat with their son, and so they were frantically searching and trying to find him. They were not able to get into a lifeboat because I guess they could have gotten in. The mother and the daughter could have gotten into a lifeboat, but the mother wasn't leaving without her son. She was searching for him. This was the only Helen was the only first-class child to die in the sinking of the Titanic. Her body was never found. All right, so I don't know if you have the boarding pass for Miss Ruth Elizabeth Becker. That's what I'm going to talk about next. She was 12. She was from India. She was traveling with her mother, sister, and brother. She was a second-class passenger, and she was traveling to Benton Harbor, Michigan. Her parents were missionaries in India, and after her brother got sick, they were advised to go back to the United States so that he could get well. Her father stayed in India, so she was traveling just with her mother, her sister, and her brother. And again, in the True Tales, there is an account of there is an explanation of the events that took place for her that evening. She was waiting on the deck with her mother. She was a second-class passenger. She was waiting with her mother, and her mother asked Ruth to go back to the cabin and get some blankets because it was cold. I mean, they hit an iceberg, so obviously there was ice in the water. It was very cold on the deck. It was night, so her mother asked her to run back to the cabin and get some blankets. When she got back to the lifeboat, her mother's sister and brother were already in a lifeboat. Her mother yelled for her, but the boat was full and they couldn't take Ruth. Ruth made it into lifeboat 13, and she did end up being reunited with her mother and her siblings. All right, next is Elizabeth Gladys Dean. She was 2 months old. She was from London. She was traveling with her father, her mother, and her brother. She was a third-class passenger traveling to New York. Her family was emigrating, which means that they were going to be moving to the United States to start a new life here. They were going to be moving to Wichita, Kansas, where her father planned to open his own business. So what happened to Elizabeth Gladys Dean? She was actually the youngest survivor of the Titanic and the last living survivor. She died at age 97. Her father died when the Titanic sunk. Her mom took her children back to London after the crash. So after they got to the United States, without her father there to open his business, they went back to London. And she was the youngest passenger that survived, and she was the last living survivor of the Titanic. All right, how about Miss Edith Eileen Brown? She was 15, traveling from South Africa. She was accompanied by her father and her mother. She was a second-class passenger, and she was traveling to Seattle, Washington. She was making a new start after her father's hotel business declined. Her older sister lived in Seattle, and they were going to go there, and that's where they were going to start over. So what happened to Miss Edith Eileen Brown? Well, she was rescued. She was rescued in lifeboat number 14. which had a rough time getting into the water. Some of the lifeboats, when they were going down, actually were tipping, and people were falling out. Her father did die in the sinking. In 1996, when she was 99, she went to the location where the boat sank. At that time, she was the oldest Titanic survivor, and that's different from the last person we just did, because she was the last living survivor, but this woman was 99, so she was older than her. So she was the oldest person, or she lived the longest after the Titanic. She lived to be the oldest age after the Titanic had sunk. And she was helped to the rail, where she threw a wreath into the ocean over the spot where the Titanic sunk. And that was when she was 99. All right, this one's kind of interesting. I kind of like this one. So this is Myra Harper. Myra was 49. She was from New York in the United States. She was traveling with her husband, Henry Harper, and her dog, whose name was Sun Yat-sen. She was a first-class passenger, and she was traveling to New York. She was returning from a trip to where she was touring Europe and Asia. And she was rescued with her husband. So her husband was one of the few men there were men that got onto lifeboats. Some of the lifeboat people allowed men to get on. There were some stories of men that would maybe jump onto a ship or into a lifeboat, or sometimes once they were in the water, they picked up people that were in the water. And so some men survived that way. So both she and her husband survived, but so did her dog, her little Pekingese puppy, which was one of 12 confirmed dogs on board the Titanic. So some of the passengers had their dogs with them. If you were a first-class passenger, you could bring your dog along. And so her dog survived also. Of the 12 dogs that were confirmed on the Titanic, only 3 of them survived, but hers did. All right, and our last person is Eugene Joseph Abbott. He was 13 years old. He was from London, England. He was accompanied by his mother and his brother. They were third-class passengers, and they were traveling to Rhode Island. They were moving back to Providence, Rhode Island with his mother and his brother. So what happened to Master Eugene? Along with his mother and his brother, Eugene jumped from the deck of the Titanic as it was sinking. The 3 ended up, because they were third-class passengers, and he was a boy, so his odds weren't good there, right? So as the boat was going down, as the boat was sinking, they jumped from the deck. The 3 ended up on some wreckage. Both of the boys died in the freezing water, but their mother did survive. She was pulled into lifeboat A. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned a lot of information about the Titanic, and I hope that it encouraged you to want to find out more information. If you stop by the library, we've got lots of books about the Titanic. We have fiction or historical fiction, which are stories about different Titanic passengers. And then we have, like I said, we have the books that are actually real tales or real stories about what happened that night. So feel free to check out our library website or our Facebook page and find out some more activities, and stop by the library and say hello. Take care and have a great day.